Robin the Boy Wonder has been one of fiction's most iconic and recognizable characters since Dick Grayson first arrived just a year after The Dark Knight's creation in 1940. Designed to be a surrogate for young male readers as well as a Watson to Batman's Sherlock Holmes, the Boy Wonder has since been defined by legacy, forging one's own identity and finding out how to stand tall outside of the Batman's very long shadow. However, as is the case with practically every character in long-form serialized fiction, there have been some ups and downs and struggles over the decades when it comes to properly conveying those themes. Whether it be the first Robin, Grayson, or his successors Jason Todd, Tim Drake, Stephanie Brown, and Damian Wayne, either through editorial meddling or missteps from particular writers over time, each of Batman's heirs have at least one controversy attached to their otherwise endearing characters. This led me to wonder, out of the mainstream Robins seen across the main canon publications, who among them has been either the most sidelined, mishandled, or overall neglected by DC Comics. I won't be talking about movies or animations, that's far too broad of a scope. I will be discussing solely the comic books. An avenue of research I find endlessly interesting is the collecting of various interviews, showing the decisions made behind the scenes which led to certain plot points being played out by our favorite heroes and villains. So I do hope you enjoy as we begin very fittingly with the first Robin of them all, now known as Nightwing. It might be hard to imagine, given all of the love and attention Nightwing's received lately, as I've well documented, being the censor of event after event, if not the leader of the entire DC universe, that he could ever be called neglected. He's the connective tissue for the entire pantheon, and is best suited to coordinate and inspire its forces. However, this upward trend really began in 2021, at least in modern history, with Taylor and company emphasizing the goal, backed by editorial this time, to finally truly elevate the character to the position which he deserved. Obviously, the hero had enjoyed the spotlight in years before then, but there is a clear delineation from what currently is versus what was before. When it comes to the character of Dick Grayson, two names are unavoidable when crossing the topic of controversy. The first and probably foremost being Dan DiDio. Get ready to hear that name a lot. It's important to establish this early on, as per his role as executive editor and co-publisher of the entire DC universe from 2004 to 2020, his decisions impacted both Nightwing and Tim Drake, mainly, at least for this video, pretty severely. Grayson's most recent ascension is in large part a product of fan demand. The first Robin is a supremely beloved character, especially to longtime comic readers. All of his recent accolades are predicated on decades of stellar characterization. That is to say, DiDio's reign over DC saw him push back against his readership's desires to put Grayson in a more central position for many years. But why? During a 2018 New York Comic-Con panel, a fan asked DiDio plainly why he hated Nightwing. He explained that while readers observed a clear evolution of Grayson's character over the years, Batman as an evergreen icon, similar to Mickey Mouse or Bugs Bunny, remained the same age, and that he feared the uncomfortable reality that one day the son might literally outgrow the father given enough time. Basically admitting that, yeah, Batman is a stagnant character, whereas Dick Grayson evolves, and that to not make Batman look bad, Nightwing would also have to suffer that same stagnation eventually. This being in spite of the many instances where Bruce has been literally physically de-aged via Lazarus Pit's timeline shenanigans or Dionysium. This insight informs the back end of decisions made by DiDio as well. We know for a fact during the DC 2006 event Infinite Crisis that Dick was supposed to lose his life against the multiversal threat Alexander Luthor. Dan argued that this would best serve the story, his death uniting the then fractured heroes, seeing Nightwing as a character on the scale of Barry Allen or Supergirl, who had sacrificed themselves in the seminal 1985 Crisis event. Further justifying his pitch, DiDio also argued that Nightwing himself was a redundant character. Tim was Robin and Bruce would never be truly replaced. Of course, Nightwing could just be his own character. As told by Mark Waid, longtime DC writer and one of the architects of the current DC initiative as of today, he, along with Infinite Crisis writer and arguably equal comic legend Jeff Johns, had to resist DiDio's demands pretty strongly. The actual scribes of these comics advocated on behalf of Grayson's household recognition, having been featured consistently in live action and animation since his inception. DiDio even wrote about a fan interaction before this event, the rumor of Nightwing's death having been spread, where an airport baggage handler refused to give Dan his suitcase unless he promised Nightwing's survival. That guy might have single-handedly saved the timeline. The writers and fans ultimately won out. Within the story itself, this manifested as the hero surviving a seemingly fatal blast from the villain, with little to no explanation as to how he survived, other than just being that guy. So Grayson would survive, but how would DiDio seek to remedy the quote-unquote redundancy problem that seemingly operated in the back of his mind at all times? His idea for what would become Infinite Crisis, which he himself revealed in a 2015 Facebook post, involved breaking Nightwing's spirit and becoming Batman's greatest villain. So the guy in charge of the entire company either wanted this dude killed off or character assassinated. As a side note, I think this says a lot about how great Nightwing is as a character, considering Dan DiDio was basically trying to cut him off at the knees, and despite that, he was still beloved and very iconic. Dick would instead shortly thereafter be promoted to the position of Batman in 2009 for a seemingly far more permanent duration than his prior assumptions of the mantle. DiDio noted this as the ultimate graduation to become the ultimate hero, in his own words. I would speculate through gritted teeth, but maybe that's just me. Similar to his recent role as the leader of the DCU, Grayson's Batman was the premier strategist on a Justice League roster composed of many successor heroes such as Jesse Quick, Donna Troy, and Supergirl. Grant Morrison, arguably the best Batman writer of all time, placed Dick Grayson in the cape and cowl and stated that a full 5 years of Dick and Damian stories would have been written if editorial approval had been granted. However, instead, Bruce Wayne's return was hastened by DiDio, with Dick still serving as Gotham's sole Batman while Bruce navigated the globe until the 2011 New 52 reboot. Many writers at the time have mentioned the hectic nature of essentially shelving decades of history and starting from scratch, mainly per the fact that its inception was seemingly so haphazard. This was Dan's brainchild, a fresh continuity to revitalize the line and make it as accessible to new readers as possible. This impacted Dick Grayson mainly, in that Scott Snyder had recently told the Black Mirror and Gates of Gotham storylines starring Dick as Batman. When seemingly out of the blue, he was told to rework his upcoming Court of Owls plot to center around Bruce Wayne instead.
And they were like, do you want to move over to Batman? We really like the movie there. And I was like, maybe if I can bring Jock and Francesco and it's still Dick Grayson. And at first that was the assumption. And then all of a sudden the New 52 came and they said, actually, we need you to be with somebody you've not worked with Greg Capullo, and it's going to be Bruce Wayne. And I was like, I don't know if I can do that.
The line between pre and post reboot in terms of character histories is especially blurry in regards to the New 52 Bat family. However, the Justice League issues just preceding the relaunch have Dick noting that Bruce's return likely means he'll revert to the role of Nightwing. Kyle Higgins, the then New 52 Nightwing author, also revealed that in addition to a change of color scheme, he was suggested to change Grayson's first name to Rick instead of Dick, even as far back as this 2010-2011 timeframe. Dick jokes, I get it, but Higgins aptly argued that no one names their kids Barry today either. In this New 52 era, the event Forever Evil would see Nightwing captured by the crime syndicate, who would expose his identity to the world before taking his life, only to be quickly resuscitated. Just like in the case of Infinite Crisis, Jeff Johns wrote this event, and it's pretty clear that a similar push and pull between Jeff and DiDio took place here. Nightwing was compromised, and you can easily see how this would lead to his retirement. Authors immediately saw this setup as fertile ground, however, with James Tynion IV, who would later frontline both Detective Comics and the main Batman title, pitched a storyline wherein Dick would assume the undercover identity of Officer John Blake to take down Owlman once and for all while a mystery Nightwing roamed the streets. This as well being the name and vocation of Dick's surrogate in the prior released Nolan Batman movies, Robin John Blake. Pushback from, presumably, DiDio abounded. Can't use Owlman, change the identity of the mystery Nightwing, and you can't go back to a blue suit. This pitch would be abandoned, instead metastasizing into the 2014 Tom King and Tim Seeley Grayson book, where Dick would go undercover as a super spy to keep secure the secrets of other superheroes. This new direction proved to be creativity born from constraint, being a standout book of its time. Many fans speculate that this book's success irked Dan, who would have likely rather seen Dick's character phased out after being unmasked. However, he did approve the pitch, greenlight the story in the first place, and even rewarded Tim Seeley's efforts on the title by giving him the keys to the initial arcs of the relaunched Rebirth Nightwing title. This was a great book for a while, and a return to the hero's norm. Some snooze-worthy arcs for sure, as certain writers rotated, but in the Tom King Batman Rebirth run beginning in 2016, we see the assassin KG Beast land a lucky sniper hit on Grayson's head. This would put the first Robin in a coma, spanning into an amnesia plotline in his own book, in yet another story of editorial meddling, which happens seemingly constantly in King's run, at least as he tells it.
I feel like I'm blaming editorial for a lot, but Dick Grayson was also not supposed to turn into Ric Grayson. That was not a thing.
I don't want to diverge too far off the path here, but if you derided this run, it's very likely due to DiDio's hands. King's own pitch for following this was a recovery mired by vertigo, with Tim Drake very briefly taking up the Nightwing mantle under Dick's direction while he recovered. This was, like the John Blake pitch, rejected. What we got instead was the Ric Grayson arc. It actually brings me physical pain to dedicate any brainpower in describing these events. Suffice to say, he becomes a jackass, wasn't a conventional crime fighter, and random people took up his mantle and stole a good chunk of the book's narrative. Benjamin Percy and Dan Jurgens, who were tasked to write this era of the character, pointed the finger at editorial mandates, extending this Ric Grayson arc well beyond any of their intentions. The Amnesia plotline was also intended to just be very brief, maybe 3 issues, but as Scott Liddell puts it, a writer most famous for probably his New 52 Red Hood books, who sort of set the very shaky foundation for the Ric Grayson arc, he argued that this status quo could go on for as long as 20 years, citing how Barbara Gordon was put in the position of Oracle for that long.
There were people in editorial who were like, well, why are we going to spend all this time? We know that he's going to be Dick Grayson again. Like, you can do it for 3 issues. And I said, it's a really cynical take, because Barbara was Oracle for 20 years.
So the timeline goes something like this. Dick Grayson is shot in Tom King's Batman storyline. He then intended for a Tim Drake Nightwing bonding subplot, but Scott Liddell somehow leveraged his influence to prolong the story arc, which totally blindsided Benjamin Percy, who was writing Nightwing at the time. Benjamin having a long-term plan for the book, and seemingly sooner stepped away from the title entirely than entertaining this Amnesia storyline. Dan Jurgens was then tasked with, or brought in to, make sense of all these disparate elements. This overlaps with Dan DiDio being pushed out of the company, which I will further detail shortly. So when Jurgens talks about how the return of Dick Grayson proper was actually delayed, this should not really have anything to do with Dan DiDio's navigating of the storylines, but it was more so out of convenience, tying into the, at the time, Joker War event that was going on across Batman titles. It does seem like Dan is at least responsible for the initial germ of the idea, this Amnesia arc. This plot thread was sort of floating in the ether for years before Ric Grayson. Grayson. Who knows, maybe it was a part of that initial Infinite Crisis pitch that would have seen Nightwing become a villain. I can only assume then that Dan himself was responsible for rejecting Tom King's Tim Drake as Nightwing pitch, and then Scott Liddell just thought this was such an awesome idea. I guess this enthusiasm just rubbed off on DiDio, since even he himself did not really want this plot to go on from what we can gather, but he was convinced seemingly, and this was protracted by the then Joker War event, like I said. On February 21st, 2020, DiDio was fired by DC's parent company, Warner Brothers, with sources allegedly close to the situation noting the cause as his fostering of a poor work environment. The Robins are only a few examples where he bore down on writers, forcing changes to plots, and he did manage to alienate many top talent. The New 52 alone played a huge part, and right around his firing, he was planning to pull the trigger again via 5G. Which is an epic story of its own. The relevant part of it was the fact that Dan intended to replace basically every legacy mantle with totally new characters. This was in large part a reason why he was fired, more than likely. The remnants of this initiative can be seen through Jace Fox being a totally dispensable Batman of New York City, whereas DiDio would have had him usurp Dick, Tim, Damian as Bruce's one and only successor. As Tom King again puts it, this is because Dan missed the era in which Dick had replaced Bruce before the New 52,
where Dick became. So 5G was kind of his, like, I missed that chance in 2008, I'm going to do it again in 2020.
Which is insane, since like I said, he arbitrarily told Grant Morrison and Scott Snyder to scrap any future Dick as Batman storyline going into the 2011 reboot. So you had two writers that were totally on board, in fact, under the assumption they would be writing more Dick Grayson, and then DiDio was like, nah, scrap it, and then years later he's like, oh, you know what was really cool is when we had the successors take over, let's try that again. But instead of characters with decades of history, it would just be basically total newbies. There are always two sides to every story. Either way, just 3 months after Dan's termination, the wheels of the Bright Knight's proper comeback began turning in both Nightwing and Batman titles, which inform his high status as of late. Like I said, however, there are two names which have hung over Nightwing like a dark cloud for years. The other being Devin Grayson, who wrote Nightwing issues 71 to 117 from 2002 to 2006. I won't lie, her run is far from all bad. I think her voice for Dick Grayson adds some interesting wrinkles here and there, but today's subject is her usage and inclusion of the Tarantula femme fatale. To preface what I'm about to say, since it's a sensitive subject for a lot of people, Devin has gone on the record repeatedly over the years to voice her regret over her choices here. For context, Blockbuster, Dick's main nemesis for nearly 100 issues at this point, has gone to great lengths to ruin his life. So when recently recruited vigilante Tarantula has the villain in her sights, her literal crosshairs, Dick in a moment of weakness allows her to take the shot. Full of regret, Nightwing immediately goes into shock, where then Tarantula takes advantage of him. Devin admits that this literal trauma needlessly crossed past the threshold of attempted metaphor. Blockbuster's death already made it clear that Tarantula had robbed Dick of his autonomy, or something like that. These are her words in the Dick Grayson Robin the Boy Wonder book, which was a great resource in making this video. She stated that the intent here was to bring the hero to his lowest point before building him back up to new heights. Of course, she was let go from the book shortly after. This grisly event coincides with Teen Titans #2 from 1992, written by Marv Wolfman, where a shape-shifting teammate assumed the identity of Starfire to get with Nightwing. Moving on to the second Robin, Jason Todd, who has a far more succinct history in this respect. Of course, his brash and abrasive attitude contrasted with his predecessor to the point that, due to fan outcry, votes were cast via a phone line to determine if the new Boy Wonder would live or die. die. This was a very close tally, and some still speculate if there was some chicanery, if one caller had rigged the system to stack votes against Jason. The legendary Batman writer and editor Denny O'Neil, most prolific during the 70s and throughout the 90s, actually gave life to this rumor in the bonus features of the Under the Red Hood film adaptation, stating that a lawyer in California used a personal computer to automatically add votes to Jason's death column. Although he notes this is mere hearsay, we will likely never know for sure. Either way, he was brutally killed by the Joker and shortly replaced after one real-world year by Tim Drake. Marv Wolfman, creator of Tim Drake and the one who wrote Dick's ascension into Nightwing, described how Tim was his chance to do the next Robin right this time. Some people like to argue if there even was a historical precedent for Jason being the quote-unquote bad Robin, and if that's more so a product of retcons. There are some pretty obvious issues where Jason does act extremely rebellious and out of line, even back in the day, and we also can't ignore the fact that, as far as we can prove to this day, more people than not just wanted him dead. I have multiple videos describing how Jason has been mishandled over the years, but this seems to be far less due to editorial interference per se, and more so Red Hood being pigeonholed by various outside factors. More aptly, I suppose, Red Hood was going to have a new R-rated title in 2025. However, after a series of bloodthirsty social media posts, which I personally don't want to give much more attention to, DC requested the deletion of these posts and a public apology. The writer refused to do so and was promptly fired, with the new book being canceled outright. So in the case of Jason, you can argue he was mishandled by the writers out of the gate since fans wanted him 6 feet under, with his character arc since then being a meandering back and forth between Punisher knockoff or reformed hero. The writer of the canceled Red Hood book did publicly admit before being fired that they had never read a Jason comic in their lives. So honestly, that is a pretty big sign of neglect that they would just hire basically a random person to write Red Hood, but bullet dodged either way. Tim Drake is more or less another victim of DiDio, given that the New 52 wildly warped his character and took a lot of the wind out of his sails since then. It might be hard to imagine now, but for an entire generation of readers, Tim Drake is the definitive Robin. He starred in a massive 185-issue solo run, forged timeless relationships in Young Justice, led his own iteration of the Teen Titans, and even graduated to the role of Red Robin after Damian's introduction. The line of succession was clear, and readers were safe to assume they were in the midst of another Nightwing tier evolution. The first big misstep was back in the 2004 Identity Crisis, another of DiDio's babies. Up until this point, Tim Drake stood apart from Bruce and Dick as he actually still had a relatively healthy family life, until Captain Boomerang broke into his father's home and murdered Jack Drake. This made Tim an orphan, later adopted by Bruce and even given his surname. But Tim still had qualities all his own and was later well written all the way until the 2011 reboot. Now, Tim Drake wasn't even his real name, but an alias after going into witness protection. He was also never known as Robin, but Red Robin from the get-go. This could have been salvaged, I suppose, but the Teen Titans run being the main source for Tim's stories in this era did him and his supporting cast no favors. In fact, a great disservice. In this timeline, Dick Grayson and company had never formally established the Titans as a unit, stripping Tim's team of any sense of legacy. Something that, despite being arguably DC's greatest strength, especially over the competition, DiDio instead was constantly trying to erase it and get rid of it. Not to mention Drake's main allies that inform his journey and identity as much as anyone in the Bat family were all warped beyond recognition too. all total strangers compared to their post-crisis selves. Even Stephanie Brown, Tim's main love interest, which allowed for him to engage in emotionally mature and topical storylines, was seemingly erased from history, not appearing in this continuity until 4 years after the relaunch. And still, she had to form a bond with Tim from scratch. Even by Rebirth, a soft reboot bringing back much of the best character histories from before the New 52, just when Tim was getting his stride back in Tinian's Detective Comics run, DiDio and company seemingly demanded he be killed off.
When I originally pitched for the series, I wanted Tim Drake to be up front and center, but they didn't want a big focus on the Bat family. They didn't want too many Robins running around, and so all of a sudden Tim was homeless, essentially, and I wanted to give him a home. And originally they were really hesitant about that.
In another example of obviously some kind of internal backdoor debate between the writer and DiDio, it was negotiated that instead of dying, Tim just appeared to have died to all of his friends and family, when in reality he'd been taken prisoner by some cosmic force that I'm not going to totally detail here. He was brought back about a year later, but outside of Tinian's run, he really hasn't had space to shine since then for years. Brian Michael Bendis, coming over from Marvel, relaunched Young Justice in an attempt to recapture the magic from the prior iteration. However, it only lasted 20 issues, being a very lightweight and disposable team book, especially compared to the original Young Justice run by Peter David, which happened to be energetic and charming while still developing the characters more substantially, and Jeff Johns' Teen Titans run, which added a new level of contemporary maturity to the Teen Titans and therefore Tim Drake himself. This new book also saw Tim adopting maybe the single worst mantle in all of comics in the form of Drake, because drakes are also birds. Some people talk trash about Red Robin sounding like a burger joint and looking like man, but it's worlds better than Drake. I actually have a working theory because Alex Ross created the Red Robin identity and he also designed the costume, and has actually butted heads with DC when they have attempted to use other characters he's created or designs he's created for, say, certain TV shows and the like. That Red Robin, at least maybe that design and name, up to a certain point is just off the table. They barely ever reference it. It barely ever shows up in flashbacks. He's just called Robin now, so there's just two Robins. So I think there is something maybe there to be said that Tim Drake is maybe legally not allowed to adopt his most mature persona. You can tell by reading Zdarsky's Batman that Tim is his favorite Robin, and his character manages to shine through once or twice, but he's not the sole focus of the narrative. His most recent solo book was also not what his fans were hoping for, only lasting 10 issues. This all being in the wake of his off-panel, inexplicable breakup with Stephanie. Now being in a relationship with his old high school buddy from his post-crisis run. I don't care who you are. The fact is, Tim and Stephanie shared and allowed for stories a million times better than anything they've managed to come up with for Bernard. Tim and her were literally made for each other, and I don't think it's a coincidence that each of them have lost some purpose and a good chunk of their identities since their split. It just makes no sense and came out of nowhere. Speaking of Steph, she was barely ever Robin, but that didn't stop DiDio from seeing her as totally expendable and at least co-signing her death by Black Mask after she nearly gets Gotham destroyed. In a 2012 Bleeding Cool interview, DiDio basically asserts that Stephanie just doesn't have enough fans to warrant keeping her around, noting how even when she was made Batgirl, the new book did not see a huge bump in readership. Of course, this was right prior to the New 52, where DiDio deemed the entire line as needing a shot in the arm. It clearly wasn't Stephanie in particular. In the Smallville Season 11 comics, spinning off from the end of the at the time popular CW show, it was intended for Stephanie Brown to be this version of Batman's sidekick. However, DiDio stepped in, forcing the writers to replace her with Barbara Gordon. There is no doubt that combined with the 1966 Batman, many of the cartoons, that Barbara Gordon is the most iconic version of Batgirl, which is also in big part why when the New 52 started, she was made Batgirl again after being Oracle for decades at that point. An example of a wheelchair-bound superhero was very inspirational to a lot of people. This is all just very confusing because obviously if you keep Stephanie from appearing in material connected to things like TV shows, then she will forever be in Barbara Gordon's shadow, at least by DiDio's logic. So why would you strong-arm her from appearing in things like that? It just doesn't make any sense to me. Which brings us to the fifth and current Robin, Damian Wayne, the first blood son of Batman. Out of the gate, Damian was seen as abrasive and annoying, lashing out against the at the time favored Tim Drake and being a pain for Bruce Wayne himself. However, the young Wayne was never meant to last, with Grant Morrison, for all intents and purposes Damian's creator, saying in a 2022 IGN interview that the young Wayne was initially planned to die after a measly 4-part story. However, Grant saw potential in the new Robin, hoping to write years and years of Dick and Damian books like I said. Ultimately, Damian would be killed off in February 2013's Batman Incorporated Volume 2, number 8, 7 years after his first appearance. This was all Grant had to say about the character, but other writers like Peter Tomasi gave him new life and continued to flesh him out alongside Superman's son. Although in that era where Bendis was writing the main Superman book, John Kent was aged up, whereas Damian stayed the same age, so now there's a weird age gap there between who should be contemporary friends. To speculate, this is either a part of Dan DiDio's anti-superhero perfect life agenda and they wanted to inject some drama into the Superman family, which has a trickle-down effect on Damian and his best friend. Or it could have just been for the sake of 5G, where John Kent was planned to take up the mantle of Superman in just a wholesale fashion. Unless it just so happened to be Bendis's sole idea that came from his own head, it seems like we also have Dan DiDio to blame for Damian having this now awkward distance between who should be his greatest ally. I think the prospect of over time seeing the son of Batman and Superman grow up together probably would have made DiDio pull out his goatee hair. Since then, it seems Damian had been mostly spared by Dan, as the presence of a roughly 14-year-old son doesn't inherently make Batman seem that much older. He has consistently enjoyed his own solo series, whether that be as the main Robin at Batman's side, a member of his own Titans team, or solo adventures. He's basically totally sidelined Tim at this point, barring a miracle, and since Dan DiDio's not in the picture anymore, it basically means that at least Damian's safe from his attention. So given all of this, who has DC failed the most? You can make the case for Jason Todd, I certainly wouldn't stop you, but to be fair, Red Hood only ever had one truly great story to his name, and it's basically just been a consistent stream of generally underwhelming attempts to diversify his appeal among the Bat family. Stephanie is an unfortunate case, but I'd diagnose her problem as general apathy rather than DiDio actually targeting her to the same extent as Dick and Tim. Her biggest problem is probably the fact that Chuck Dixon, her creator, was more or less blacklisted by DC, and no one else knew how to use her to full strength. Damian, I think, unless some new editor comes along that can't stand him, he's probably going to enjoy a bright future compared to what his older brothers had to put up with. After laying it all out there, it is pretty insane how much DiDio wanted Nightwing taken out back and shot. After he was fired from DC, he was allowed to write a single issue all about how only if Nightwing was killed in Infinite Crisis as he intended, everything in the DCU would be peaceful and better off for it. Purely dedicated to the hate. However, despite some ups and downs, the staff of writers and the fans in Grayson's corner overpowered Dan far more often than otherwise. Since DiDio left, the Nightwing book was nominated nominated for and earned multiple Eisner Awards, putting it on the same tier as Watchmen or Dark Knight Returns, at least insofar as the Oscars of comics are considered. The Tarantula incident is a very visceral mistake, which the writer will likely have to contend with for the rest of her career. Sadly though, if you look into almost any A-tier character's history, you are going to find something similar. Let's not forget how Damian was really conceived after all. But to be honest, this whole video could have been solely about Tim Drake's mishandling since the New 52. Think about how far he's fallen. Even with Damian taking the Robin mantle from him, that probably did him a favor, since it freed him up to undertake his own version of Grayson's evolution into a role all his own. He was the Robin, at least in the comics, for over 20 years. Now he can't even hold down his own book for more than 10 issues. While I'm writing this video, Dick Grayson is in Nightwing, Titans, World's Finest, Batman and Robin Year One, and more. Jason just had a mini-series about his days as Robin. He'll be in the DC KO event, Tim won't, and Jason would have had a solo title if not for the writer. Damian is in Batman and Robin and has consistently appeared in Detective Comics. He's even started to physically outpace Drake here and there. Tim has zero book of his own by comparison, no Young Justice or anything, and will have to share page time with Damian in the main Batman book. This hypothetical has its pros and cons, but if the New 52 never happened, we could have easily seen Dick pass the mantle of Batman down to Tim by now. He's got no team, no good relationship, basically no book, whereas in his heyday, he was genuinely shaping up to be the next heart and soul of the DCU. Still though, historically, I do think Dick being the #1 most wanted by DC's boss probably does make him the most neglected when we look at the big picture. He fought for years to kill him off, break his spirits, sideline him to irrelevancy, put him in a coma, brainwash him. It's crazy. Since DiDio was fired, Nightwing has thrived, but in the case of Tim, now there's just no excuse. He needs top tier talent giving him a spotlight, putting him back on track and course correcting. In conclusion, I did not set out to make an expose on Dan DiDio, but the more I looked, he was pulling the strings behind nearly every controversy. And don't even get me started on Wally West. With all that said, I hope all of you were entertained. Take care, and I'll see you all next time.
Dan DiDio, who I like, who I enjoy as a human being, and was a great advocate for comics and fought a lot of behind the scenes that kept comics alive for a lot of time. And a lot of behind the scenes that Dan would find, an old creator who'd worked in the 50s or 60s, who'd be like, I don't have health insurance. And Dan would make sure they had a book. And like, he would do like very kind things for creators. But he was a little nuts.